When Sam Pike lay dying from a rattlesnake's bite, his final words bound Jack Holt to a woman he'd never seen marry her. Keep her safe. Jack kept that vow, but vows don't stop fire bullets or the greed of men like Luke Cross. On the night his barn burned, Jack discovered Rose Kane wasn't a burden to protect. She was a fighter, clever and unyielding, standing shoulder to shoulder with him in the flames. What began as obligation would be tested by betrayal, tempered in fire, and reborn as something far stronger: redemption, healing, and the first sparks of love. The Wyoming night had the kind of darkness that swallowed men whole. No stars, no moon, just a black sky stretched taut over the land like a worn hide. A bitter wind knifed through the valley, carrying the acrid scent of burning timber. Jack Holt's barn was ablaze, orange tongues of fire clawing upward, throwing jagged shadows over the snow-packed ground. He stood in the yard, rifle steady against his shoulder boots, rooted deep into the frost. Beads of sweat slid cold down his temples despite the winter air, and each exhale rose before him in a pale cloud. Somewhere out there, past the halo of firelight, Luke Cross's hired guns were closing in. Jack didn't know how many, didn't much care. If they wanted to break him, they'd have to walk straight through his sights. But he wasn't alone. Rose Kane stood just off his shoulder, her figure cut sharp against the fire's glow. The lantern in her hand swayed gently, casting warm light over her auburn hair and the hard, clear set of her green eyes. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't pleading. If anything, she looked like she was taking the measure of the night and daring it to blink first. She leaned close, her voice a low, deliberate whisper that sliced through the roar of the flames. We can use the light. Make them think we've got more men out here than we do. Jack glanced sideways at her. She was no ranch girl born and bred. Her speech still carried the faint music of Boston, every word clipped and sure. Yet here she was, standing in the freezing dark, facing down armed men without a flicker of fear. He hadn't married her for moments like this. Truth be told, he hadn't married her for himself at all. It had been Sam Pike's voice, dry, strained, and fading fast, that bound them together. Jack still remembered kneeling in the dust beside his friend, the angry swelling of the rattlesnake bite crawling up Sam's leg. Marry her. Promise me, Jack. Keep her safe. Jack had nodded once, the kind of nod a man gives when he means it down to his bones. He'd buried Sam the next day and boarded the stage to meet a woman he'd never seen. Rose Kane had not been what he expected, not a desperate widow or a timid stranger. She stepped down from that coach like she owned the ground it rolled in on her back, straight, her hat brim shadowing a steady, searching gaze. She carried herself with the kind of quiet authority you didn't argue with, not if you had sense. Now, as sparks from the burning barn drifted skyward like fireflies, Jack felt the weight of that promise pressing hard against his ribs. He had sworn to keep her safe. That meant stopping Luke Cross tonight. The cold bit deeper as he shifted his stance, listening. Somewhere in the dark, boots crunched on crusted snow. The firelight danced across the barrel of his Winchester. He tightened his grip. Rose's hand brushed his sleeve, light, quick, but enough to steady him. Her lantern tilted slightly, spilling light across the yard in jagged, unpredictable arcs. She was already playing the game she'd suggested, painting shadows that hinted at movement where there was none. To a nervous man in the dark, it would look like riders circling, rifles ready. Jack felt the corner of his mouth lift just a fraction. He hadn't asked for her courage, hadn't expected her cunning, but with every heartbeat in that firelit yard, he was beginning to understand something dangerous. This woman wasn't just a promise he was keeping. She might be the one thing in this cold, unforgiving land he couldn't afford to lose. And if Luke Cross wanted to test that, he'd find out just how far Jack Holt was willing to go. The late afternoon sun bled gold across Carson's Crossing, setting the dust in the street aglow. Jack Holt stood outside Carson's general store boots, planted wide, his shadow stretching long toward the hitching post. The brim of his weathered hat tilted low to cut the glare, but it couldn't block out the weight pressing in from his coat pocket. There, folded and creased, lay Sam Pike's will, short, spare, and heavy as iron. 3 weeks earlier, Sam's voice had been little more than a rasp in the dry Wyoming wind. Jack had found him sprawled in the dirt behind the north corral, the angry red swell of a rattlesnake bite climbing up his leg. He'd tried knife cut to the wound, sucking the poison a tourniquet tied tight, but the venom had already gone too far. Sam's eyes had locked on his. Rose Kane. Marry her. He'd said each word pulled from deep inside, fighting for air. Promise me you'll take care of her, Jack. It wasn't the kind of request you argued with, not between men who had ridden the same trails and slept under the same cold stars. Years back, Sam had pulled Jack from under a dead horse when bullets were still flying. That kind of debt didn't vanish. And in Sam's last moments, Jack had given the only answer a man like him could. By dawn, Sam Pike was in the ground, and Jack was saddling up for the telegraph office. His wire to Boston was short. Sam Pike is gone. I will honor the marriage if you wish. Jack Holt. Now here he stood, waiting for her. He'd built an image in his mind over the past weeks, likely a weary woman past the first blush of youth, thin from hard winters, and bad luck, grateful for a roof and a man's name to hold off the wolves. The frontier was a hard place for a woman alone. Jack had seen it grind the shine out of people in a hurry. The sound of harness bells broke his thoughts. A stagecoach rattled into town wheels, bouncing through deep ruts, a plume of ochre dust chasing it. The driver hauled back on the reins, and the team stamped and snorted at the sudden halt. Jack's jaw tightened. The door swung open, and the first thing he saw was a boot, a small, well-made leather boot, polished despite the road dust. Then the hem of a dark green traveling dress, the fabric catching the sun as its wearer stepped down with an ease that didn't speak of desperation. She stood straight as a fence post, her waist cinched, her posture set. Auburn hair, pinned up beneath a modest hat, caught the light in copper flashes, and her eyes, green steady, appraising, swept the street like she was assessing each soul in it. Jack found himself adjusting his stance. This was no fragile runaway, no downtrodden spinster clinging to her last chance. This was a woman who had chosen to be here, and something in that fact unsettled him more than he cared to admit. She crossed the distance between them with deliberate steps, gloved hands gripping a small reticule. Mr. Holt. Her voice carried the faintest trace of Ireland, softened by the crisp edges of Boston schooling. Yes, ma'am, Jack said, tipping his hat. I'm Jack Holt. I'm Rose Kane. I understand you were expecting me. He nodded once. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Sam spoke of you often. The truth was, Sam had barely mentioned her beyond her name and the fact that she taught school. But Jack wasn't about to lay bare how much of a stranger she was to him, not with the whole street watching. Rose's gaze didn't flicker. Thank you. I also understand there's been a change in our arrangement. Jack shifted his weight. Sam asked me to honor his commitment. If you're willing, the preacher's ready now. For the first time, her fingers tightened on the handle of her bag. And if I'm not willing, then you'll be on the next coach to Cheyenne. Tickets on me. You can go wherever you like from there. Her brows lifted just slightly. She hadn't expected to be given a choice, and if he was honest, he hadn't expected to offer one. She studied him for a long moment, the noise of the street fading between them. Before I decide, Mr. Holt, I'd like to know why you agreed to this. You don't strike me as a man without prospects. A few heads nearby turned their way. Jack could feel the stares from the porch rail and the store windows. Sam was my brother, in all but blood, Jack said evenly. Saved my life once. I owed him, and this is the debt he asked me to pay. Her lips pressed into a thin line. And what would that make me to you? A wife in name only. A servant. The bluntness hit harder than he'd expected. You'd have a home, food, protection, exactly what Sam wanted for you. Nothing more, unless you wanted it. Rose glanced briefly at the faces around them, then back at him, something unreadable in her expression. Let's talk in private, Mr. Holt. Jack stepped aside, gesturing toward the store's back room, the will in his pocket feeling heavier than ever. The back room of Carson's general store was little more than 4 plank walls, a small desk scarred by years of hard use, and the smell of leather flour and strong coffee. A single oil lamp hissed on the wall, its glow pooling over the space. The faint murmur of the street faded as the door shut behind them, leaving only the sound of boots on creaking floorboards. Rose Kane set her reticule neatly on the edge of the desk, removing her gloves with precise, deliberate tugs. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood with her back straight, her chin lifted, her green eyes fixed on Jack Holt, as though she were measuring more than his words, measuring the man himself. Mr. Holt. She began, her tone even but edged. You're marrying me out of duty, not desire. Is that correct? Jack removed his hat, turning it once in his hands before setting it on a barrel in the corner. That's right. I gave Sam my word. I keep my word. Her gaze softened for only a breath, then hardened again. Good. I respect a man who honors a promise. But I need you to understand something. My agreeing to marry you doesn't mean I've agreed to belong to you. Jack's brows drew together slightly. You think I'm the kind to claim ownership? I think the frontier is full of men who do, she replied without hesitation. I've seen what happens to women who lose their say in their own lives. I won't be one of them. Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it grew steadier as she went on. I didn't come here looking for romance. I didn't come here looking for rescue. I came for opportunity, and I'll work for it. But I will not be treated as property. Jack leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. You came all the way from Boston for opportunity. What kind? Her lips pressed together briefly as though deciding whether to tell him. Then she straightened her shoulders. I was a school teacher in Boston for 6 years. My father's debts stripped us of everything, and when the school board learned of it, they dismissed me. Said I brought shame to the institution. I'm not ashamed of anything except their hypocrisy. Sam's letters offered me a way to start over, a home, a respectable name, and the chance to teach again. That is why I came. Jack studied her for a long moment. He'd expected desperation, not the calm conviction standing before him now. That's a damn fool reason to fire a teacher, he said before he could stop himself. The corners of her mouth curved just slightly, the first trace of warmth he'd seen in her expression. Boston has its ways, she said, but you and I need to be clear. I will contribute here. I'll take on the work that needs doing. But I expect respect. I expect independence. If that's not agreeable, say so now. Jack felt something shift in him. Her words didn't grate, they rang true. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said finally. Sam told me you were smart and hardworking. The ranch could use that. Rose nodded once as if to seal the terms. Then she moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside to glance at the street. Her dress rustled softly as she turned back. Then we understand each other. Shall we proceed to the church? Jack was about to answer, when movement caught his eye through the curtain, a shadow crossing the road. Luke Cross. Tall, lean, sharp-eyed, he strolled into view with the slow confidence of a man who'd never been told no and made it stick. He tipped his hat toward Jack, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Heard about your wedding, Holt. Hope it don't distract you from business. Jack kept his tone flat, not distracted. Cross's gaze drifted to Rose, and something in his look turned predatory. "That land Sam left you would fetch a fine price for the railroad." "Not for sale," Jack said, voice like cold iron. Luke smirked. "We'll see." He tipped his hat again, this time to Rose, before sauntering away. Jack let the curtain fall. His gut churned. Cross didn't make idle threats. And if the man's interest in Rose was even a fraction of what Jack had just read in his eyes, trouble was coming faster than winter. When he turned back, Rose was watching him closely. "Friend of yours?" she asked, her tone dry. "Not hardly." She studied him for another moment, then reached for her gloves. "Then let's not keep the preacher waiting. We've got work ahead of us, Mr. Holt, and I'd rather face it with the ink on our names still fresh." Jack picked up his hat, his jaw set. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the looming shadow of Luke Cross, or the fact that this woman, bound to him by a dead man's wish, was already stirring feelings he'd sworn to bury. 3 weeks into the marriage, the Holt Ranch had found its rhythm again, though the rhythm wasn't entirely Jack's doing. Rose Kane moved through the place with quiet efficiency. Her presence felt in 100 small improvements, rows of vegetables sprouting in the kitchen garden jars, lined neat in the pantry, the accounts ledger written in a tidy hand. She still rose before dawn to teach at the small schoolhouse in Carson's Crossing, returning in the afternoon with dust on her hem and the faint scent of chalk on her skin. Jack told himself it was just the ranch running well that put him at ease, but every day he caught himself noticing more than he should the way she brushed back a strand of auburn hair with her wrist when her hands were wet, the curve of her smile when she coaxed a stubborn calf back into its pen, the quick, sharp way her mind worked when a problem arose. He had promised Sam Pike that the marriage would be one of protection and respect. He hadn't promised to keep his distance, but he'd decided on it anyway. The trouble was, Rose seemed to carry a heat that seeped into the coldest corners of him without trying. It was a Friday evening, the air crisp with the first bite of winter. Jack sat on the porch mending a bridle, his hands working leather through the fading light. Inside, the warm glow of the kitchen lamp spilled onto the yard. Rose stood at the wash basin sleeves rolled above her elbows, forearms pale against the dark blue of her dress. She moved with steady purpose, drying the last of the supper dishes. Jack tried to keep his eyes on the bridle, but his gaze drifted to her anyway. The fire in the hearth lit her profile, high cheekbones, the line of her jaw, the soft movement of her lips as she hummed some tune from Boston he didn't know. He told himself it was harmless to look, just a moment's notice. But the longer he watched, the tighter his chest felt. When she bent to stow a pot on the lower shelf, the lamplight caught on the curve of her hip. Jack's hand stilled on the bridle strap. Without thinking, he set the leather aside and rose his boots, whispering against the porch boards. The wind carried the scent of pine and faint lavender as he stepped into the kitchen. Rose glanced up, startled for a heartbeat, then steadied. "Did you need something?" "Supper was good," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "That stew recipe Elena's?" "Yes," she said, a small smile curving her lips, "though I'm still learning what grows best out here." She leaned lightly against the counter, fingers playing absently with the edge of her apron. The movement pulled the fabric taut across her waist, and Jack's throat tightened. He crossed the room to fetch a coffee mug from the shelf, his arm brushing hers as he reached past. The contact was brief, but enough to send a jolt through him. She froze, breath catching just slightly. Their eyes met hers, clear, steady, but with something unguarded flickering beneath. His own darkened with a need he'd kept locked away for years. He stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, to see the faint pulse at the hollow of her throat. Jack's hand lifted of its own accord, brushing against her cheek, before sliding back to the nape of her neck. There against his fingertips he felt a thin chain. His gaze followed it to where a small gold ring rested just above her collarbone. For a heartbeat he thought of asking about it, but the way the firelight struck the ring so much like the one his sister Mary had worn until her last breath hit him like a blow. In an instant the warmth in his chest turned to ice. He dropped his hand, stepping back as though burned. Rose's brows knit, confusion flashing across her face. "Jack, what?" A shout cut through her words. Rafe's voice from the corral, sharp with urgency. "Fence is down, cattle's loose." Jack grabbed his rifle from the wall without another word. Rose moved toward the door, but he caught her arm just long enough to say, "Stay close to the house." Her fingers lingered on his sleeve for a fraction longer than necessary. A silent question he didn't answer. Then he was out the door, boots pounding over the frozen ground toward the commotion. Behind him, Rose stood in the doorway, the lamplight haloing her figure, watching him disappear into the dark. Jack told himself the cold wind in his face would push her from his mind. But as he reached the corral, heart hammering, he knew it wasn't just the fence that had been breached that night. Something inside him, something he'd thought was locked up tight, had already been broken open. The Wyoming night had turned savage. Snow still clung in drifts along the fence line, the remnants of last week's storm, but the wind had shifted, driving a sharp, biting cold down from the ridges. Jack Holt sprinted toward the corral boots, punching through the crusted snow, his rifle clutched in one hand. The shouts of Rafe and young Cole cut through the dark, tangled with the frantic bawls of cattle on the loose. Behind him, the glow of the ranch house flickered, and then Rose Kane appeared, a lantern swinging in her grip. She moved fast, skirts catching on the wind, her breath visible in quick, steady bursts. "You should be inside," Jack barked over his shoulder. "Not a chance," she called back, her voice carrying with startling clarity. They reached the corral together, the scene unfolding in chaos. Sections of the east fence lay splintered posts cut clean as if by an axe. Shadows moved beyond the churned snowmen, not beasts, darting in and out of sight. Jack's gut tightened. This wasn't an accident. Luke Cross's men had been here, and they weren't just after a few head of cattle. They meant to cripple the ranch. "Drive 'em toward the south gate," Rafe shouted, waving his arms to turn the nearest steers. Cole was already running along the fence line, his breath coming hard. Jack scanned the dark rifle-ready senses, straining. The air carried more than cold, and fear it carried smoke. Faint at first, then stronger, curling into the night. "Jack." Rose's voice came low but urgent. She had turned toward the barn. "Look." A tongue of flame licked up the far side of the structure, small but growing fast, feeding on the dry wood. "Damn it," Jack muttered, already moving. The memory came unbidden. His sister Mary's house going up in flames years ago. The way the heat had been a living thing, roaring and relentless, and how he'd been too far away to save her. He wasn't going to watch another fire take everything. "Rafe," Jack barked. "Get the hands to the pump, Cole, with me." He turned to Rose. "Stay with the herd." Her eyes flashed in the lantern light. "I'm not leaving you to fight this alone." Before he could argue, she was already setting down her lantern and grabbing a bucket from the pump. The muscles in her back tensed beneath her dress as she hauled water, the wind driving smoke toward them in choking waves. Jack took his place in the bucket line, passing full pails to the next man, his arms burning with the effort. Rose worked beside him without pause, her cheeks flushed from heat and cold, her hands reddened and raw. From the corner of his eye, Jack caught movement, a figure slipping along the barn's far side, torch in hand. One of Cross's men. Jack's instinct screamed to raise the rifle, but before he could, Rose's hand gripped his arm. "Wait," she hissed, breath warm against his ear. Her eyes flicked toward her lantern, still burning steady on the ground. Use the light. Jack understood at once. He grabbed the lantern and swung it high, casting wild, jerking shadows across the snow and barn wall. In the shifting glow, it looked like a dozen men were closing in. The raider hesitated, then bolted into the darkness, spooked by the phantom army. The fire fought them hard, spitting sparks into the night, but inch by inch the line of men and women doused the flames. When the last embers hissed under a final splash of water, the barn stood blackened but still upright on one side. The damage was bad, but not total. The cattle were another matter. The herd was scattered hoofprints and churned snow marking their panicked flight. The corral was a wreck. And Jack's reserves of cash, already stretched thin, wouldn't cover a full rebuild before winter dug in. He stood in the smoky haze, chest heaving, the acrid scent clinging to his clothes. Rose was beside him, soot streaked across her cheek, strands of hair pulled loose from her bun and curling damp at her temples. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were steady. "We can't let Cross win," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. Then her gaze locked on his. "The Ward place, it's up for sale. We buy it breed cavalry horses. It'll pay for the repairs and more." Jack looked at her, half expecting the idea to be wild talk after a fight like this, but she wasn't guessing. She'd thought it through. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the same quick mind she'd used to outwit a raider minutes ago. Judge Ward was head of the school board, which meant he had influence with the bank. If Rose could get him to back the plan, they might just pull it off. It was a gamble, the kind that could lose them everything if it failed. But standing there in the fire-lit ruin, Jack realized something. He trusted her, maybe more than he trusted himself. By the time the first light of dawn slid over the ridge, the Holt Ranch was silent, except for the low crackle of cooling embers. Smoke drifted in thin gray ribbons from the barn's scorched timbers, carrying the bitter scent of wet ash. The snow around the structure was trampled into mud streaked with black soot. Jack Holt stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the damage. The barn would need more than patchwork. It would need half its frame replaced before it was safe again. Rose Kane came to stand beside him, her breath visible in the cold, her skirt still damp at the hem from hauling water through the night. Soot streaked her cheek, a lock of hair curling against her temple. She looked tired, but not defeated. If anything, there was a steel edge to her now that hadn't been there before the fire. "We can't rebuild just to stand still," she said quietly. "If we do, Cross will just come again." Jack glanced at her. "And you've got a way to stop him." Her eyes locked with his. "We buy Judge Ward's place, turn it into a horse breeding operation for the cavalry. There's a demand, and we've got the pasture for it. Ward's on the school board. He can help us get a loan." Jack rubbed a hand over his jaw. The idea was bold, risky. They'd have to mortgage the ranch to make it work. One bad season and they'd lose everything Sam Pike had left them. But Rose's tone carried no hesitation, no trace of doubt. Before he could answer, movement caught his eye. Rafe was walking toward them from the barn, a small, scorched leather pouch in his hands. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Found this in the loft," Rafe said, offering the pouch to Jack. Almost went up with the rest of it. Jack took it, the leather warm from Rafe's grip. The pouch smelled faintly of smoke and char. Inside was a single envelope, the edges browned, but the wax seal still intact. The name written across the front stopped him cold. Miss Rose Kane. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sam Pike's, bold and deliberate. Jack's stomach tightened. In all their years of friendship, Sam had never once mentioned writing directly to Rose. He turned to her, holding the envelope out. "It's addressed to you." Rose's brow furrowed as she took it, her gloved fingers brushing his. She broke the seal carefully, as though afraid the paper might crumble. Jack found himself watching her face more than the letter, searching for the shift in her expression. Her eyes moved over the page, the faintest flicker crossing her features, surprise, sorrow, and something else he couldn't name. She drew in a breath, then looked at him. "You should hear this," she said softly. She began to read aloud. Sam's voice came to life in the room between them, confessions written in ink, meant to be found only after his death. Rose, I know this letter may never find your hands, but if it does, I want you to understand the truth. I cared for you more than I ever let on. I would have asked you to be my wife, but I could not give you the life you deserved. I chose instead to send for you, hoping to offer you a place where you could stand on your own 2 feet. If fate has taken me, I trust Jack Holt to do right by you. He is the better man, the one who will keep his word even when it costs him. Let him. He will guard your spirit as fiercely as he guards your life." When she finished, silence hung between them. Jack felt the words like a weight in his chest. Sam had never spoken of love, not this way, and certainly never suggested that Jack was the better man. Rose folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into its envelope. Her gaze found his steady and unflinching. "This doesn't change the deal we made, Jack. But maybe it changes how we see it." Jack searched her face, the firelight from the house catching in her green eyes. "How's that?" "We're not just holding to Sam's promise anymore," she said quietly. "We're building something of our own." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand. It was warm despite the cold, her fingers strong in his grip. For a long moment, they stood together in the smoky dawn, the ranch around them battered but unbroken. Jack realized that whatever came next, the gamble on the Ward place, the fight with Luke Cross, the risk of losing it all, he wasn't facing it alone. And that changed everything. The first clean light of morning spilled over the high ridge, painting the snow a pale gold. Smoke from the night's fire drifted in thin wisps above the barn's blackened roof, curling toward a sky that was finally clear. Jack Holt stood in the yard, boots planted in the churned earth, taking in the damage. The barn was scarred, but still standing, the corral a mess of broken rails. Beyond the fence line, the land stretched wide and white silent, except for the caw of a crow somewhere out near the creek. Rose Kane stepped up beside him, her skirts brushing the frost, a strand of auburn hair loose against her cheek. The exhaustion in her face couldn't hide the fierce set of her jaw. She looked at the barn, then at the horizon, as if she could already see the fight ahead. "We'll rebuild," she said, simply, the words carrying more resolve than any oath. "But not just what we had. Something stronger. Something they can't burn down." Jack turned to look at her. The night before, she'd fought shoulder to shoulder with him, hauling water, braving smoke, facing men who'd come to wreck everything. She'd thought fast, acted faster, and stood her ground. She wasn't just Sam Pike's intended anymore. She was his partner in every sense that mattered. Her plan for Judge Ward's spread was still risky. The numbers would be tight, the work hard. But in the cold morning light, Jack felt the weight of the choice ease. He trusted her judgment. More than that, he trusted her grit. They'd taken the letter from Sam inside, reading it again by the kitchen fire. The words were simple but unshakable. Sam's quiet confession of affection for Rose, his admission that Jack was the man who could give her the life he could not. It wasn't just a blessing. It was a passing of the torch. Jack had read the letter twice before setting it down on the table. "He thought more of me than I ever deserved," he'd said. Rose had met his gaze without hesitation. Maybe he saw something in both of us. We're here now. That has to mean something. Out in the yard, the crunch of boots on frost pulled Jack from the memory. Rafe was leading the first of the scattered cattle back into the pasture, Cole trailing with a rope over his shoulder. Life was already pressing forward. Jack glanced at Rose. "We'll go into town tomorrow. Talk to Ward. See if the bank will listen." "They will," she said, not as hope, but as fact. From the hill beyond the far pasture, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a horse's hooves. Jack's eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line. No riders broke the open snow, but he knew Luke Cross wasn't done. The man would come again in daylight or dark. And when he did, Jack wouldn't just be defending a promise made to a dying friend. He'd be defending the woman beside him, the land under their boots, and the life they were building together. Rose seemed to read the thought in his silence. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers strong and warm against the cold. "We're not going to be easy to run off," she said. Jack gave a short nod. "No, we're not." They stood there a moment longer, watching the sun climb. It was brighter now, spilling gold across the snow, touching the charred barn and the half-mended corral like a promise that the land and the people on it could heal. Finally, Jack squeezed her hand and started toward the house. "Come on," he said. "We've got work to do." Rose fell into step beside him. The day ahead would be long, the weeks ahead longer still. But for the first time in years, Jack felt a steady, quiet certainty settle in his chest. Whatever storms came next, they'd face them the same way they had last night together, in the firelight unyielding. And somewhere beyond the far ridge, the road stretched on under a winter sun, waiting for the two of them to take it. If this story stirred something in your soul, a memory, a tear, a spark of hope, don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the West. Here we honor tales of quiet courage, healing, and redemption from the heart of the frontier. New stories every week that stay with you long after the fire dies down.